Wuni kisak, the tawamag, kanitampag. Let's cut the squampson. Good day, family and friends. How are you doing? Neesu Wushuwunoag, Director General, Federation of Aboriginal Nations of America. Hoping this day finds you well. Back with another informational video. Just to give some perspective, this is, I guess we're a bit surprised. This is, I guess, still a engaging dialogue that's taking place, at least from what we've been seeing on social media lately and whatnot. And especially following up on the last video that was put up talking about the Snyder Act 2020 census, but pertinent to today's discussion, Moorish Aboriginals. Wanted to do a video today just kind of clearly laying out just three basic reasons why. Indians are not Moors. Just three basic reasons why Indians are not Moors. And I'm going to do this in a 1-3-2 manner. The one being, first, what the answer to that question should be. And in our opinion, there's only one answer to that question. The three being three separate perspectives to view it from, so that you'll understand that calling Indians Moors doesn't make sense. It's not appropriate. It's not accurate. And then lastly, the two is the two reasons why someone's telling you that. But for the short title, we'll call it 3 reasons why Indians aren't Moors. And this is very pertinent discussion to have, because when you look at what we're going to do, what I'll be touching upon today, you'll understand that when you attempt to do that, you're really doing damage to the individuals who are the Indians. So let's start first with the one answer you give when someone says Indians are Moors. And that answer is no, they're not. That's the one and only answer that anyone should be giving when the conversation comes up that Indians are Moors. No, they're not. Indians are not Moors. And I'm going to get into the reasoning behind that in one moment, but I just want to reiterate, Indians are not Moors. We here at the Federation, I can speak to my people, I can speak to Pokanokets, I can speak to the Nipmucks that are in the area. You know, we have always known who we were. We just could not figure out how to navigate this system of colonization that was upon us. But at no point did we ever not know who we were, and we knew that we were Indians was the term that that was utilized, what they called us, Indians. And then later on, people started getting into the Native American stuff, but Indians. I'm a Narragansett Indian. That's what you would hear. I'm a Narragansett Indian. So we have always known that we are Indians. It was not until we started to move into the understanding of higher level understandings of how we interact with the law that the term Moor came about. That was fairly recently, 2015, 2014. That's when that term Moor first surfaced for us up here. So we've always known that we're Indians by this system, never by Moors. So the answer to that question has to be no then, because if you have a group of Indians that are saying, no, we've never been Moors, how can you argue that Indians are Moors? Indians are Moors is a very generalized term that means that all Indians are Moors, and yet you have a very distinct group of Indians who are saying, no, we were never Moors. So the first answer, the first step, one, the only answer you give when someone says Indians are Moors is no. No, Indians are not Moors. Now, let's look at the 3 perspectives on why that's a true statement. Because we can't just make statements. I can't just make a claim like that, right? And then not explain to you why. And it has to be something that you can understand and go and look up yourself, right? Because if not, then it's a bunch of hogwash. If you can't verify what someone's saying, and if they can't speak to the specificity and provide evidence of what they're saying, then what are they really saying? So let's look at the three perspectives on why that's the only answer you can give. And the first we're going to look at is from a historical perspective. And I'm not going to go too deep on this, just give some specific examples that you can go once again and go look up yourself. But we know that Columbus said that he was sailing to the West Indies. And that when he was sailing to the West Indies, there were Moors on the ship helping to get him over here. So clearly he knew who Moors were. Clearly Columbus knew who Moors were, what Moors were. Moors came out of Spain. That's what the understanding is, right? Before any European white colonization to these lands, they were dealing with the Moors over in Spain. So they clearly knew who Moors were. So when Columbus said he was sailing to the West Indies and got over there and called the people Indians, clearly there had to be a separate groupings of people from the Moors. That's just basic understanding. If Columbus said that he was going to the West Indies and bumped into Indians, and he had Moors with him, and he was aware of Moors in Spain and all that, then common sense would say, okay, there must be some sort of distinction between Indians and Moors. But that's very general. Let's go even deeper than that. And let's look at the treaties that the colonial era entities over here had with Indian tribes and Indian nations. And I'll just give you a few. You have the Colonial Treaty with the Pilgrims in 1621. You have the Narragansetts and Mohegan Treaty with the, I think it was Mass Bay or Connecticut colonies. All of these colonies, before there were states, there were the colonies. Remember the 13 colonies? So these colonies were forming treaties with different Indian nations based on the lands they were at. So you have the Poconokeets in 1621. You have the Narragansetts, we didn't have ours in our language, but the Narragansetts and Mohegans in 1638 when they realigned against the Pequots. And there was a lot of infighting going on. And this is the point. Historically, when the colonies came here, even the British Crown, which gave them permission to come over here, were looking at each of the different Indian nations as their own kingdoms, and the chiefs of those nations as the kings. That's the only concept that they could compare how we conducted ourselves here. And each of these kingdoms they had to engage in with separately. There was no one mass. They had to engage with them separately. So you have the Narragansetts and Mohegans 1638. You have the Treaty of 1646 between the Powhatans and the English. This is down to Virginia. So you're going from Mass and north to Rhode Island and Connecticut areas. Now we're down into Virginia. Now we're going to jump to the Great Treaty of 1722 between the 5 nations, which are the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Mohawk, and the Seneca, all in upstate New York and Canada areas. They're having a treaty along with the Mohicans and the colony of New York, the colony of Virginia, and the colony of Pennsylvania. So you have those 5 separate nations and the Mohicans, so that's 6 separate nations and 3 colonies forming a treaty. And then that's 1722. And then in 1778, you still have treaties being formed with the Delaware, who are really the Lenape. So when you look at all of these treaties that are being held, none of them are with Moors. All of them are with Indian nations. And they would also call them Aborigines. American Indians, Indian nations, Aboriginal title, all of these terms are out there. Aboriginal title. That's the premier title to the land. Look it up. Look it up. So Aboriginal title. So all of these different Indian nations were forming treaties with the colonies prior to a U.S. existing. And if you look at FANA, well, we have Poconokeets, we have Narragansetts, we have Lenapes, and we also have Powhatans who are in FANA, in the ranks of FANA. So when you're talking historically, especially from this perspective, from a personal perspective, it is totally inaccurate to call me a Moor. I'm an Indian by the colonial terminology. And from the conversation that I've heard about Moors, all of their official treaties and rights to be in this land either stem from one or two sources. And fill me in if I'm wrong, but one or two sources, either from the U.S., and they talk about treaties they have with the U.S., but then to me, if you're talking the U.S., you're talking post-1776, right? That's the American Revolution and all that, somewhere in that time frame. And that's 100 to 150 years after what my people went through. So if you're talking treaties with the U.S. as your reason for being over here, then you're talking far too late in terms of our experience. Or else they're talking underneath the Kingdom of Morocco, and clearly you can see with the treaties that are being signed between the colonial entities and the Indian tribes, there was no jurisdiction for Morocco over here. Unless you're arguing that the European colonial entities were under Morocco, because you most certainly can't argue that any of the Indian tribes were under Morocco. And if you come and speak to the actual Indian tribes, we will tell you, no, we were never under Morocco and we're not Moors. So historically, it's very inaccurate and inappropriate. And actually does a lot of damage to the specific histories and experiences of the Indian tribes that were here in these lands when you say that Indians are Moors. So that's the first point. Historically, it's inaccurate. Now let's look at the second point from a legal perspective. And this is probably the most perplexing to us, because all of this conversation about Moors being Indians, Indians being Moors and all that, it's all based in legal terminology. That's what everyone's arguing, and that's what everyone's basing things on, these terms. And they're going to tell you that a Moor was this, and that this means that, and this, and black isn't and you need a nationality. And then they're going to go and tell you that you should call yourself a Moor and not an Indian in many instances. And if we just look at it from the legalese perspective, what this terminology actually means when you get into a court of law, when you say this to a law enforcement officer. An Indian, according to Ballantyne's Law, 3rd edition, 1969, and I'm paraphrasing, but please go look it up, you'll see it's an aboriginal inhabitant of North America or South America at the time of interaction with Columbus, I believe. So that's what an Indian is. In legalese, when you walk into a court of law, you can argue that an Indian is this. Not based off of the historical aspect of it, because you can have all of the history, but if you're not using the proper terminology when you get into court, then it doesn't matter. You can be as right can be, and you'll still lose. So we're talking strictly from a legalese perspective. So when I walk into court and say, well, I'm an Indian, according to Ballantyne's Law, 3rd edition, then they know that I'm an aboriginal inhabitant of North America or South America when I get into a court of law. What am I saying when I walk into a court of law and say that I'm a Moor? And I just typed in Moor, Black's Law on Google. And this is the definition I got up. I think it's either 2nd edition or 4th edition. I think it might be 2nd. But a Moor is an officer in the Isle of Man who summons the courts for several sheetings. I don't even know what that means. But I know it's not an aboriginal inhabitant of North America or South America. So then why would I walk into court if I'm claiming to be an American Aborigine, indigenous to these lands, an Aboriginal individual of these lands, an Aboriginal inhabitant of these lands? Why would I then walk into court claiming to be a Moor? Why, from a legalese perspective, why would I do that? And let me take it a step further, because a lot of the interest, at least from our perspective, in people looking at and holding the Moors in esteem, and let me even go a little bit further, this conversation is not for any individuals who just practice Moorish science and try to live according to the principles and guidelines that are proposed there. We don't get into what your personal spiritual beliefs are. Those are between you and Creator. We have our own, you have yours. Aquani, we say peace be unto you. We are talking about, and this video is geared towards the individuals who are claiming to be Moors, but also trying to pretend that they're us. If you're claiming to be a Moor, then you're not an Indian. And that's really what this video was meant to clear up. So, having said that, speaking once again from the legalese aspect of it, what the real issue is that success is being seen because of the type of court that these arguments are being made in. And they're I haven't seen any in a federal jurisdiction. All of them are being made in state, county, municipal, traffic, whatever the case may be. And yes, they're going to be successful because the ultimate argument is that you're a foreign national to the U.S. So by law, foreign nationals are out of the jurisdiction of states. All of these lower level things, they're federal jurisdiction. So you may see Moors, because of the law and how it can be presented and the claim that they're making to be a foreign national, to be able to dupe judges and stop judges in those type of courts. But that's not going to be the case when they get into a federal court, because foreign nationals are federal jurisdiction. They are federal jurisdiction. So this is why claiming to be a Moor is not, and a foreign national is not going to put you in a position where you're superior to the law. It's just going to put you under federal jurisdiction and have you not be a citizen of the U.S. if you're claiming to be a Moorish national. You're still under federal jurisdiction. When an Indian says, I'm an Indian, it's known not only that are they, well, if you're, since the Snyder Act is still a citizen, you're just a specific history or relationship, a specific type of citizen. But an Indian is going to at least show that by law, you are connected to that Aboriginal bloodline to these lands. So what we say at FANA is we're foreign national non-resident inhabitants, because a Moor, by law, is going to be considered a foreign national resident, not of these lands, a resident. You're from Morocco, you're from wherever, but you're not here by permission of the U.S., right? But you're not an inhabitant because you're not an Indian. So you're going to be a foreign national resident. And this is what I've been trying to stress to people. If you make yourself a foreign national to the U.S., but you're not an inhabitant of these lands, by having the bloodline connection, then by law, you're going to put yourself in a position to be labeled a black identity extremist if you go out arguing you don't have to follow the laws of the U.S. You're going to. Because they're going to look at you and say, okay, you're not under state or municipal or county jurisdiction. You're under federal because you're not an Indian. You weren't here before us. So legally speaking, if you look at the definitions, an Indian being an Aboriginal inhabitant of North America or South America, and a Moor being an officer in the Isle of Man who summons the courts for several sheetings, legally it does not make any sense. It is inappropriate and inaccurate to say that Indians are Moors. It doesn't make sense. So that's two. That's the historical reasoning why, perspective why. That's the legal perspective why. The last is going to be, in my opinion, the most important, the cultural perspective why. Because when you look at it from a cultural perspective, these terms, Indian, Moor, are just classifications of people. They do not speak to the individuality of the different nations and different people that comprise those constituencies. So when you say an Indian, well, you're talking about the Haudenosaunee, who are up in New York and Pennsylvania, as well as us Southeast Algonquian tribes down here. And what could even confuse you more is the fact that we're all wampum people. We all wear wampum. You'll see Iroquois all the time. We're wampumon. You'll see people from here from the southeastern New England areas. We're wampumon. That's our thing. So we're Indians and we're wampum people, but if you were to argue that a Narragansett is the same as a Cayuga, a Pokanoket is the same as a Seneca, a Nipmuc is the same as an Oneida, a Massachusetts is the same as an Onondaga, or a Pequot is the same as a Mohawk, you're out your mind. You clearly have no understanding of the cultural nuances, the differences in language, the differences in foods, the differences in regalia that they wore, just the differences between these Indian nations from a cultural perspective. And I'm unaware of any Moorish individuals being able to speak to those differences. What I consistently hear when people try to say that Indians are Moors is that they take one experience, usually the Trail of Tears, and they try to put it on all Indians and say, we all went through that, and we didn't. All Indians didn't go through the King Philip's War. All Indians didn't go through the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. All Indians didn't go through the French-Indian Wars. Or all Indians didn't go through those. So you cannot just claim that one experience is the experience of everyone. And culturally, you cannot hop up and say you're gonna, think about how insulting this is. you're going to bring back the Aboriginal culture, because now what you're saying is that the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Narragansett, the Pokanoket, the Nahantic, the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc. You hear what I'm saying? That their cultures are gone, and that you're the one to bring their cultures back. And when you say you're going to revitalize the language, you're saying that the language of these people that I just listed and all of the other nations who have been here since here was here are in need for you to bring back their language, because they don't have it. So when you make statements like that, when you say you're going to form the copper-colored nation, all of that, it disrespects every single nation I listed and the thousands of others who are out there. I'm going to say thousands because I'm not a fan of federal recognition. You're an Indian because of your blood and who your people are and where you come from and your relationship to these lands, not because the federal government says that you can go on its list to get funding. Or they'll allow you to let them put your land in their trust. So, for all of the Indian nations out there that have been keeping, and their ancestors who fought this fight before the ones that are here now, it is total disrespect to say that you're revitalizing their culture or their language because you're going to bring back the Aboriginal culture or the Aboriginal language. Beyond disrespectful, beyond untraditional, and totally culturally inappropriate and inaccurate. So those are the three perspectives. So first, the one answer is no, Indians are not Moors. The three perspectives on why are that historically it's inaccurate, legally and lawfully it's inaccurate, and culturally it's inaccurate. It's not true. It's just not true. And then lastly, the two reasons why someone is telling you that. Because there's only two reasons why in our opinion. Two reasons why someone would try to argue with you after you tell them no, Indians are not Moors. After you explain to them that historically it makes no sense that you would say Indians are Moors. And if you explain to them that legally it makes no sense that you would say that Indians are Moors. And if you say to them culturally it makes no sense that you would say that Indians are Moors, right? It makes no sense. And specifically the cultural one, because what is Moorish culture? What is Indian culture? There is no Indian culture. Indian is a classification. There's Eastern Woodland culture, which is different than Northern Plains culture. And then once you get into that subgroup of culture, then you have individual tribal cultures, right? Then once you get into that subgroup, you have different nation cultures. Then once you get into that subgroup, you have different tribes that make up the nations that do things different ways, right? Then once you get into the tribes, you have different clans that do things different ways, right? So to say that there's an Indian culture or that there's an Aboriginal culture is absurd. It's totally, completely, unequivocally absurd. Everything breaks down to specifics. And Indian understands that. Indian respects that in the eyes of the law. I don't think Moore does that. It's an officer in the Isle of Man. They're all from the Isle of Man. So the two reasons why someone would be continuing to argue with you after you said no, the one, and after you gave the three reasons why, the two reasons why they would continue to argue with you. And the first is that they're either misinformed, uninformed, or don't know what they're talking about. Plain and simple. They're either misinformed about what the difference is between an Indian and a Moor, you're uninformed about what the differences are between an Indian and a Moor, or you just don't know what you're talking about in general. You're just talking. And we try to give space for those to be reasons why someone could be trying to argue with us when we tell them no, we're not Moors, you know, because you always want to give the benefit of the doubt, right? You always want to, at least in our opinion, you want to hope that individuals are coming in a good way. Now you prepare for the fact that they're not. You're always prepared for the fact that someone just might not be, but you always want to give the benefit of the doubt that hopefully they are, right? Hopefully they are. Because if you don't, it'll be a very ugly world out there if you start looking at it like everyone out there is out to get you. And a lot of times it can look like that. So we always try to give the benefit of the doubt that you're coming in a good way. Because we're going to come in a good way. So they're either misinformed, uninformed, or they just plain don't know. That's the first First reasoning why someone's going to try to argue with you that Indians are Moors. That's the first reasoning why. And once again, we always try to give credence to that. So, one, no, Indians aren't Moors. There's only one answer you can give. 3 perspectives why. Historically, it's inaccurate. Legally, lawfully, it's inaccurate. Culturally, it's inaccurate. And the 2 reasons why someone's going to argue with you about that or keep trying to tell you that. And the first being that they're misinformed, uninformed, or just don't know what they're talking about. The second one, and this is why I say, and this is why we say, you have to be concerned with those of them out there who have your worst interest in mind. Because the only other reason, if they're not misinformed, uninformed, or don't know what they're talking about, if they know very well what they're talking about, then the only other reason they're telling you that the Indians are Moors is because they're trying to deceive you. That's the only other reason that they would be telling you that Indians are Moors. If someone can look at just the 3 basic, and you can go deeper, go look at all of the Indian treaties that were being signed before the American Revolution. Go look at it. Go look up the other definitions that tie in with, look up the legal definitions. Look up a foreign national. Look up a resident versus inhabitant. Just look up the different cultures. Type in Indian cultures, and basic info will come up explaining all of the different type of cultures, how they were tied in with the lands, how they spoke different languages. Just go look it up. It's all out there. Push of a button. The only reason that after you explain all of that and show all of that, that they will continue to try to impress upon you that indeed more Indians are Moors, is that they're trying to deceive you. They're trying to deceive you. And it's a shame, because a lot of these people that are trying to deceive us look just like you and me when we talk to them, and if we look in the mirror, they look just like you and me. The 85-15% rule. 85% be truth, the last 15, and if they're good, 10 or 5% of what they're kicking is straight nonsense. And you need to know who you are in order to safeguard yourself against it. Because if you don't know who you are, if you don't know what your culture is, if you don't know what your history is, if you don't know what your relationship is with this law system that we're in, someone is liable to come and tell you anything that you might buy into because it sounds good, because you don't know about the other 15, 10, 5% they're talking about. If you don't know who you are and what your experience is and what your relationship is and what your culture is, you're liable to be duped by someone who has your worst interest in mind. The black identity extremist identification is real. It is going to be, or it is, a domestic terrorist designation. Do not claim to be something that you're not sure that you are. And do not, please, do not buy into the notion that Indians are Moors. Moors are Moors. And if you're a Moor, then you should be engaging with what your history is with these lands as a Moor. And a lot of it's not that great, especially when it comes to us Indians. And like I say, if you can't acknowledge the truth of the matter, what the relationship was like, what others like you calling themselves a Moor did to our people, it is very hard for us to engage with you on any level with any sense of integrity. And when you have individuals out here claiming to be Moors, also claiming to be indigenous to these lands, also claiming that Indians are Moors, it is an affront to us. So for our Moorish brothers and sisters out there, we say, please speak to your people, because it causes issues. It gets the Indians from out west calling all of us here fakes and liars. And none of that's true. Not for the nations that FANA deals with, and not for a lot of you out there. So at every instance, we have to make sure that it is understood who we are and also who we are not. And once again, no disrespect to any individual out there who practice the Moorish science ways and follows Moorish principles. I'm not too versed in them, but no disrespect to any of them. The issue was with the individuals claiming to be Moors, trying to mix that in with the history and experiences of the people that they labeled Indians have had since they've gotten here. So one answer to the conversation about our Indians, Moors, no. 3 perspectives on why Indians aren't Moors. Historically, legally, lawfully, and culturally, it's inaccurate. And 2 reasons why someone's trying to tell you that, even after you explain that to them. Either 1, they're misinformed, uninformed, they just don't know what they're talking about. Or 2, and the one that you have to be leery of, is that they're trying to deceive you. Indians are not Moors. Indians are specific groupings of people who are all put under one classification of Indians, but who are as diverse and numerous as the sands of the seas in these lands. And the history of the Indian, this colonial term, should not be washed away and should not be massed together for some economic or ulterior motive that just disregards the fact that these same nations that were here when European colonization started are still here fighting to this day. We say Aniski Tumpawag, we still remain. When you claim that Indians are Moors, you're saying that I don't remain anymore. And that's not something that any of us who have Indian blood in us should be willing to entertain or stand for. Katapatush wuchi achusuta natawa makanitampag. Pishkanash. Thank you for listening to me, family and friends. I hope to see you soon. Aho.